They called me a simple woman. Those were Marcus Stone's exact words when he looked me up and down in that sterile conference room at Titan Industries. I was wearing my father's old work jacket, the one with grease stains that never came out, and carrying a toolbox that had seen more honest work than his $1,000 suit ever would. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes naturally to men who inherited their power. "I appreciate you coming in, but this is quite beyond what a simple woman like yourself could understand." Simple. The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying engine. If only he knew what this simple woman had been building in her garage for the past 3 years. If only he understood that the impossible engine sitting in his facility, the one that had stumped his team of Harvard-educated engineers for 6 months, was based on my father's designs. Designs that Marcus Stone had stolen 20 years ago when he bought out my father's small automotive shop and buried the patents under corporate red tape. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up in that room, facing down the man who destroyed my family, armed with nothing but the truth and a plan that would make him regret every single word. It started 3 weeks ago when I got the call. Sarah Williams from the local news station had been digging into Titan Industries' government contracts when she stumbled across something interesting. A prototype engine that was supposed to revolutionize military vehicles. An engine that consumed 40% less fuel while producing twice the power. The only problem was, it didn't work. 6 months, 12 engineers, and $3 million later, Marcus Stone was facing the possibility of losing the biggest contract in his company's history. "Emma," Sarah had said over coffee at Murphy's Diner, the same place where my father used to take me for pancakes after working on cars all Saturday, "I found something you need to see." She slid a manila folder across the worn Formica table. Inside were copies of technical specifications, patent applications, and a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was my father's engine. Not similar to it, not inspired by it. It was the exact design he'd worked on for 15 years, the one he'd sketched and resketched on napkins during our diner visits, the one he'd built and rebuilt in our garage until his hands were permanently stained with oil and his dreams were crushed under the weight of legal fees he couldn't afford. Thomas Miller had been a small-town mechanic with big ideas. While other guys his age were content fixing carburetors and changing oil, Dad saw patterns in combustion that others missed. He understood that engines were more than just metal and moving parts. They were symphonies of precisely timed explosions, each note dependent on the others. His revolutionary design used a dual compression system that most engineers said was impossible. But Dad made it work. I watched him do it 100 times in our garage, the engine purring like a contented cat while producing power that defied physics textbooks. Marcus Stone had watched too, apparently. As a young executive looking to make his mark, he'd visited Dad's shop in 2004 under the pretense of discussing a partnership. Dad, trusting as always, had shown him everything. 3 months later, Stone bought the shop for a fraction of its worth, citing financial difficulties that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Suddenly, suppliers were demanding immediate payment, the bank was calling in loans, and customers were mysteriously taking their business elsewhere. Dad held on as long as he could, but when your dreams are being systematically dismantled by someone with deeper pockets and fewer scruples, there's only so much fight left in you. The sale was final on a Tuesday in October. Stone promised to keep Dad on as head mechanic, even gave him a small bonus for innovative concepts that might prove useful. Those concepts, it turned out, were worth millions, but Dad never saw another penny. Within 6 months, he'd been restructured out of his job, his designs locked away in Titan Industries' patent vault like prisoners in a corporate dungeon. He spent the next decade fighting in courts he couldn't afford against lawyers who billed more per hour than he made in a month. The stress killed him slowly, one rejected appeal at a time. By the time he died 3 years ago, Dad weighed 90 pounds and couldn't afford his heart medication. His last words to me were an apology for not being strong enough to see justice done. But here's what Marcus Stone didn't know about the Miller family. We don't give up. We just change tactics. After Dad's funeral, I sold my apartment in Portland and moved back to his house. I got a job at the power plant, steady work that paid well enough to keep the lights on and the mortgage current. But every evening I was in that garage, studying Dad's notes, understanding his work in ways I'd never had time for when he was alive. Dad had been brilliant, but he'd also been trusting. He'd kept meticulous records of everything. Every conversation with Stone, every meeting, every broken promise. He documented the mysterious financial troubles that had forced the sale, the strange timing of supplier demands, the customers who'd suddenly vanished. It was all there, waiting for someone patient enough to connect the dots. That someone turned out to be me. And Sarah Williams, who had the investigative instincts of a bloodhound and the moral compass Dad always said was rarer than honest mechanics. Together, we'd built a case that would make Marcus Stone wish he'd never heard the name Miller. Which brings us back to that conference room, where Stone was about to learn that sometimes the simple woman in the room is the most dangerous person he'll ever meet. "Mr. Stone," I said, setting my toolbox on his pristine conference table with a satisfying thunk, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You see, I didn't come here to fix your engine. I came here to reclaim it." The color drained from his face like oil from a cracked pan. He knew exactly who I was and why I was there. But he recovered quickly, the way men like him always do, with bluster and lawyers and carefully constructed denials. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying, Miss Miller. The engine you're referring to was developed by our team using my father's dual compression design that you stole 20 years ago when you destroyed his business." I opened my toolbox, not to pull out wrenches or screwdrivers, but to reveal the real weapons I'd brought. Manila folders thick with documentation, photographs, and legal papers that would make his expensive lawyers earn their retainer fees. "I have everything, Marcus. Every meeting you had with my father, every lie you told, every dirty trick you used to force him into selling. But, more importantly, I have this." I pulled out a small device that looked like a harmless thumb drive, but contained something far more valuable: the complete technical specifications for Dad's engine, including the one crucial element that his stolen patents didn't include, the element that made his impossible engine actually work. You see, Dad wasn't just brilliant, he was also paranoid. After the first time someone tried to steal his ideas at a trade show in Detroit, he'd learned to keep the most important details to himself. His patents were complete enough to prove ownership, but incomplete enough to prevent replication. The missing piece, the exact timing sequences and pressure calibrations that made the dual compression system function, existed only in his notes. Notes that I'd spent 3 years learning to understand. Notes that were now burned into my memory as permanently as the grease stains on his old jacket. "You want your engine to work?" I asked, watching Stone's face cycle through expressions of rage, fear, and calculating greed. "You want to save your $3 million government contract and your company's reputation? Then we're going to have a very different kind of conversation than the one you planned. But first, let me tell you what happened in the weeks leading up to this moment, because you need to understand exactly how deeply Marcus Stone had buried himself in lies and how much he was about to lose when the truth finally came to light. After Sarah showed me those documents at Murphy Steiner, I didn't sleep for 3 days. I sat in Dad's garage, surrounded by his tools and dreams, reading through every patent application, every technical specification, every piece of correspondence that proved what I'd suspected for years. Marcus Stone hadn't just stolen an idea, he'd stolen a legacy, a man's life's work, and then used it to build an empire while the original creator died broke and forgotten. But knowledge without proof is just anger, and anger without a plan is just noise. I needed more than moral outrage to take down Marcus Stone. I needed evidence that would hold up in court, and I needed leverage that would force him to listen. That's when I remembered something Dad used to say. "Emma, the best way to expose a liar is to give them enough rope to hang themselves." Stone's rope was his ego. He'd spent 20 years telling everyone that he was a visionary, a brilliant innovator who'd revolutionized engine design. He'd given speeches at industry conferences, been featured on magazine covers, won awards for innovations that belonged to my father. His entire reputation was built on a lie, and lies have a way of unraveling when you pull the right thread. I started with the patent office. Every filing is public record, and Dad's original applications were still there, dated years before Stone's breakthrough designs. The similarities weren't just striking, they were identical, down to the positioning of cooling vents and the angle of compression chambers. Any competent patent attorney could see that Stone's designs were derivative works. But Dad hadn't been able to afford competent patent attorneys. Stone's team, however, had been very competent indeed. They'd found ways to file continuation patents, improvement patents, and design around patents that created a legal maze around Dad's original work. They'd used the system's complexity against a small-town mechanic who just wanted to build better engines. But complex systems work both ways. The same legal maze that had protected Stone's theft for 20 years also documented every step of the process. Every filing, every claim, every improvement was a breadcrumb trail leading back to Dad's garage. I just had to follow it. That's where Jake Morrison came in. Jake was a patent attorney who'd grown up 3 towns over, the son of a mechanic himself. He'd made his fortune helping tech companies navigate intellectual property disputes, but he'd never forgotten where he came from. When Sarah introduced us at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, I could see the anger building in his eyes as I told him Dad's story. "Your father's case isn't unusual," Jake said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Big companies do this all the time. They target small innovators, create artificial financial pressure, force them to sell for pennies, and then bury the original patents under layers of corporate filings. But Emma, your father's case is particularly egregious. Stone didn't just steal the design. He stole the entire business model, the customer relationships, even the supplier connections. This wasn't just patent theft. This was systematic corporate warfare." Jake worked pro bono, which was lucky because I couldn't afford his usual rates. For 2 weeks, he and his team dissected every legal document related to Dad's sale to Stone, every patent filing, every corporate restructuring that had followed. What they found was a pattern of predatory behavior that went far beyond Dad's case. Stone had done this before to at least 6 other small inventors across 3 states. He'd refined the process into a well-oiled machine for destroying dreams and stealing innovations. But Jake also found something else, a weakness in Stone's legal armor. In his arrogance, Stone had been sloppy with one crucial detail. When he'd filed his improvement patents on Dad's design, he'd claimed that his versions solved problems that didn't actually exist in the original design. He'd essentially admitted in legal documents that Dad's engine already worked perfectly, but had claimed credit for improvements that were purely cosmetic. More importantly, those improvement patents had expired last year. The core technology, Dad's dual compression system, had fallen back into public domain. Legally, anyone could build and sell engines using Dad's original design. But Stone didn't know that, and neither did his lawyers, apparently. They'd been so focused on maintaining their maze of continuation patents that they'd missed the expiration of the ones that actually mattered. "Emma," Jake said, his grin spreading across his face like sunrise, "your father's design is free and clear. Stone has no legal claim to it whatsoever. In fact, if we can prove that his current prototype is based on your father's expired patents, we can argue that he's been defrauding the government by claiming proprietary ownership of public domain technology." That was our smoking gun. But we needed one more piece. Proof that Stone's impossible engine was actually Dad's design. That's where my 3 years in the garage finally paid off. I knew Dad's work better than anyone alive, including the team of engineers that Stone had hired to reverse engineer what they couldn't understand. The dual compression system wasn't just about the mechanical components. It was about the precise timing and pressure relationships that made those components work together. Dad had discovered that by synchronizing 2 compression cycles in a specific rhythm, he could extract nearly twice the power from the same amount of fuel. But the timing had to be perfect, down to milliseconds, and the pressure relationships had to be calibrated to tolerances that most shops couldn't measure, let alone maintain. I'd built my own version of Dad's engine in the garage, using modern materials and computer-controlled timing systems that hadn't existed when he was working. My engine didn't just work, it exceeded Dad's original performance specs by 15%. I had video documentation of every test, performance data that would make Stone's engineers weep with envy, and, most importantly, I had the missing piece that Stone needed to make his stolen prototype function. That missing piece was my insurance policy, my guarantee that Marcus Stone would have to listen when I walked into his conference room. But I also had something else, a plan that would give Dad the recognition he'd never received in life, and make Stone pay for 20 years of lies. Sarah had been working her own angle during those 2 weeks. As an investigative journalist, she understood that legal victories meant nothing if the public never heard about them. She had been quietly building a story that would expose not just Dad's case, but the pattern of predatory behavior that Stone had used against other inventors. She had interviews with 3 other victims, documentation of Stone's systematic approach to corporate theft, and a smoking gun that would destroy his reputation even if the legal case somehow failed. The smoking gun was a recording. One of Stone's former employees, a woman named Helen Carter, who'd been forced out of the company for redundancy after 15 years of loyal service, had kept every audio recording from every meeting where Stone had discussed his acquisition strategy. Helen had been Stone's executive assistant during the period when he'd targeted Dad's business, and she'd listened to him bragging about his tactics to other executives. She'd heard him laugh about the simple mechanic who'd been too trusting to protect his own work. She'd recorded him describing Dad's financial troubles as an opportunity to acquire valuable IP at a significant discount. Most damning of all, she'd recorded Stone explicitly acknowledging that Dad's design was superior to anything his own engineers had developed, and that acquiring the rights to it was essential to Titan Industries' future growth in the automotive sector. Helen had kept those recordings for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to use them. When Sarah reached out to her about Dad's case, she'd found that moment. "Your father wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last," Helen told Sarah during their recorded interview. "Marcus Stone built his empire on stolen dreams, and he convinced himself that made him a visionary instead of a thief. But dreams have a way of finding their way home, don't they?" "They do indeed. And Dad's dream was about to come home with interest. Which brings us back to that conference room where Marcus Stone was staring at me like I'd just materialized from his worst nightmare. He'd spent 20 years telling himself that what he'd done to my father was just business, just the natural order of things where the strong survived and the weak were consumed. But now the simple woman standing in front of him held the power to unravel everything he'd built. "What do you want?" he asked, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, his voice didn't carry the casual arrogance that seemed to be his default setting. What did I want? Justice for my father, recognition for his work, accountability for 20 years of lies. But mostly, I wanted Marcus Stone to understand that actions have consequences, even if those consequences sometimes take decades to arrive. "I want you to make this right," I told him. "All of it." Stone laughed, but it was the hollow sound that desperate men make when they're trying to convince themselves that they're still in control. "Miss Miller, I understand you're emotional about your father's passing, but business is business. Even if your claims had merit, which they don't, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing fraud," I interrupted, opening the first folder and sliding a document across the table. "And it definitely doesn't apply to federal contract violations. You see, Marcus, when you submitted your proposal for that government contract, you swore under penalty of perjury that your engine design was original, proprietary technology developed by Titan Industries." His face went white. Government contracts were serious business, especially military ones. False claims could result in criminal charges, massive fines, and the kind of federal investigation that destroyed companies and sent executives to prison. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. "You can't prove that my design is based on your father's work." I pulled out my phone and opened a video file. The screen showed my garage where Dad's engine, my improved version of Dad's engine, was purring with mechanical perfection. The camera panned to show the fuel consumption meter, the power output display, the temperature readings that proved this engine was delivering exactly the performance that Stone had promised the government but failed to deliver. "This is my father's design," I said, letting the video play while Stone watched his stolen dreams come to life in a simple garage workshop, built with publicly available components using specifications that have been in the patent office for 20 years. Your team of Harvard-educated engineers couldn't make it work because they were missing the crucial calibration data that Dad never included in his patent filings, the data that I learned by watching him work for 15 years. Stone tried to speak, but I wasn't finished. "Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. First, you're going to publicly acknowledge that the engine design you've claimed as your own was originally created by Thomas Miller of Miller's Automotive. You're going to issue a formal apology for the 20 years of lies, and you're going to establish a memorial fund in my father's name to support other small inventors who have been targeted by predatory corporations." "That's impossible. The board would never—" "Second," I continued, ignoring his interruption, "you're going to pay licensing fees for the use of Dad's design, retroactive to 2004 when you first stole it. My attorney has calculated the value at approximately $12 million plus interest and damages." Stone's face had gone from white to gray. $12 million would destroy his quarterly earnings, tank his stock price, and probably cost him his job. But I wasn't done. "Third, you're going to honor the government contract using my improved version of Dad's design, and you're going to give full credit to Thomas Miller as the original inventor. The licensing fees for government use will be donated to the memorial fund." "And if I refuse?" Stone asked, though we both knew he was just buying time to think of an escape route that didn't exist. I opened the second folder and pulled out a different set of documents. Then Sarah Williams publishes her story about your pattern of predatory behavior towards small inventors. Jake Morrison files a federal lawsuit for contract fraud. Helen Carter releases the recordings where you brag about destroying my father's business, and I release the technical specifications for Dad's engine to the public domain, along with the calibration data that makes it work. Stone's face went through a fascinating series of expressions as he processed the full scope of what he was facing: public humiliation, criminal investigation, financial ruin, and the complete collapse of the reputation he'd spent decades building on stolen work. But the most beautiful part was that I hadn't offered him a way out that let him save face. He was going to acknowledge Dad's work publicly or watch his entire empire crumble in very public fashion. "You're asking me to destroy my own company," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied, standing up and closing my folders. "I'm asking you to tell the truth. If telling the truth destroys your company, that says something about the foundation you built it on, doesn't it?" I picked up my toolbox and headed toward the door, but stopped when my hand touched the handle. "You have 48 hours to decide, Marcus. After that, the story goes public and the lawyers take over. But I want you to know something before I go." I turned back to face him, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as the powerful CEO who destroyed my father, but as a scared, aging man who'd built his life on lies and was finally facing the consequences. My father died thinking he was a failure. He died believing that his life's work didn't matter, that he wasn't smart enough or strong enough to protect what he'd created. But he was wrong about one thing. I smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it felt genuine. He raised a daughter who's exactly smart enough and exactly strong enough to finish what he started. Dad always said the truth has a way of coming out. Eventually. Well, Marcus, Eventually is here. I walked out of that conference room and didn't look back. 47 hours later, Sarah Williams broke the story that would become the most read investigative piece in her newspaper's history. The headline read, "Local CEO Built Empire on Stolen Dreams, the Thomas Miller Story." The article detailed everything. Dad's original innovations, Stone's systematic campaign to destroy his business, the pattern of predatory behavior against other small inventors, and, most importantly, the truth about the impossible engine that had made Marcus Stone famous. But the story didn't end with the newspaper article. Within hours of publication, three things happened that nobody could have predicted. First, Helen Carter's recordings went viral on social media. Hearing Marcus Stone laugh about destroying some simple mechanic while he stole credit for Dad's work sparked outrage that spread far beyond our small town. Hashtag Justice for Thomas Miller became a trending hashtag, and suddenly Dad's story was being shared by millions of people who understood what it meant to have your dreams stolen by someone with more power and fewer scruples. Second, 5 other inventors came forward with their own stories about Marcus Stone's predatory tactics. Jake Morrison found himself representing a class action lawsuit that could destroy Titan Industries completely. The pattern of behavior that Sarah had uncovered was just the tip of an iceberg that went back 30 years and involved dozens of stolen innovations. Third, and most unexpectedly, the government canceled Stone's contract and offered it to me instead. Apparently, when you can actually deliver the performance that you promise, government procurement officers take notice. Within a week, I went from being a simple woman working at a power plant to being the CEO of Miller Industries, the company that Dad should have been able to build if Marcus Stone hadn't stolen his future. 6 months later, I stood in the Titan Industries parking lot watching moving trucks carry out the equipment from what had once been Stone's R&D facility. The company had declared bankruptcy after the class action lawsuit and criminal investigation became more than their legal team could handle. Stone himself was facing federal charges for contract fraud, and his legendary arrogance had been replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man watching everything he'd built collapse around him. But the most satisfying part wasn't Stone's downfall. It was what rose from the ashes. The Thomas Miller Memorial Fund had already helped 3 small inventors protect their patents and build sustainable businesses around their innovations. Dad's name was now on the engine that would power the next generation of military vehicles, giving him the recognition he'd never received in life. And in my garage, where Dad had first showed me the magic of precisely timed explosions and perfectly calibrated pressure, I was building something new. Something that would have made him proud. Marcus Stone had called me a simple woman, but he'd been wrong about everything else. So why should I have expected him to understand that either? Simple doesn't mean weak. Simple means focused. Simple means knowing exactly what matters and refusing to be distracted by anything else. What mattered was justice for my father, recognition for his work, and making sure that no other dreamer would have their future stolen by someone who mistook power for intelligence and theft for innovation. In the end, that's exactly what this simple woman delivered. And Dad, wherever you are, I hope you know that your dreams didn't die with you. They just took a little longer to come home than either of us expected.